I'm really honored. Thor has the most amazing resume and bio. So I'm going to read his bio. Um, Author and biologist Thor Hanson is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Schweitzer Environmental Fellow, and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. His books include Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds, Feathers, and The Impenetrable Forest, as well as an illustrated children's favorite, Bartholomew Quill. Thor's work has been translated into a dozen languages and earned many accolades, including the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science and 3 Pacific Northwest Book Awards. He co-hosted the PBS nature series, American Spring Life, and has been a guest on programs ranging from Fresh Air to Science Friday, On Point, and Wired Currents. Hanson lives with his wife and son on an island in the Pacific Northwest. So today, Thor will speak to us about the nature and necessity of bees. And Thor has told us he really looks forward to answering our questions, and that's his favorite part of the whole panel. So we're going to answer your questions at the end. And if you would put your questions in the chat, he will answer. I will moderate for him those our questions in chat, and we'll answer the chat questions first. And if you haven't put it in chat, we'll open it up and we can just have a forum and ask what we'd like. So here we go, Thor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you to Dixie and Alex and everyone at the Garden Club, all of you, for inviting me to be here with you again. I keep turning up like a bad penny, but at least I did turn up this time. Last year, I think I was out working in the yard when I was supposed to be giving a lecture to you. So at any rate, it's very nice to be with you all. And I know that we would prefer to be in person, but on the other hand, it is good that we have the Zoom as a backup when the virus strikes. And I know it's also possible on Zoom to sort of blur out the background. I see some of you know that trick. I haven't learned that trick, so I'm using actual real fog in the background. This is real fog. I'm outside on a hilltop near our place here on the south end of San Juan Island, which has better reception for getting the internet than where we live. So actually, as I'm speaking here already, the fog is beginning to lift and the skies are clearing. So you may see the progress behind me as we go through the lecture this morning. So I wanted to start by, sort of answering a question for you. I'm often asked, sort of how I got into this line of work, this sort of combination of science and storytelling that has become a career for me. And I would like to be able to tell you that was all part of my master plan, and that, I graduated with a degree from scientific storytelling school or something to that effect, but that's not the case. This really isn't a career that you hear about from the guidance counselor. It comes about in another way. And I've thought about it a lot. And I think for me, at least, it really boils down to curiosity. Now, if you've ever spent time around young children, you'll know that, at about age 4, perhaps, the predominant thing that they say, the predominant question they have is why? And I think I never quite made it beyond that phase. Now, there may be many things about my personality that are still stuck at age 4, but certainly I can't stop asking questions. I've always been a curious person, and that habit led me very naturally to a career in science, where asking questions, that's the job. I mean, questions and hypotheses are the coin of the realm in science. And from there, it continued and led me on to writing books, where I really get to dive deeply into the questions that fascinate me so much. And another part of this whole career then is getting situations like this, where I get to hang around virtually, in this case, with people who are fascinated by the very same things that interest me. I know that you are curious people as well, or you wouldn't have tuned in on this beautiful morning. So you won't mind then if I start again with another question, and that is why bees? Why be interested in bees? Why study them? Why go to the trouble of writing a whole book about them? Well, my interest in bees really dates back to an experience that I had in graduate school when I was studying large rainforest trees in Central America. And I had genetically fingerprinted all of the trees in this particular landscape because I was interested in how pollen and seeds were moving around. And if I knew the genetics of all the individuals, I could track the progress of their pollen and where their children were going in the form of seeds and so forth. And as I looked at that pollen data, I could tell that something way up there in the forest canopy was moving pollen around among these trees, not just between neighboring individuals, but among trees that were over 1.5 miles apart. And because these trees are members of the pea family and they had flowers, beautiful big purple flowers, just like a sweet pea flower or the garden peas in your backyard there on Lopez, I knew that those pollinators had to be bees. So I became determined to figure out what was pollinating, what species of bees were pollinating these trees. And I co-opted a colleague of mine who's an entomologist into joining me for a project down there. And we hoisted up all manner of different sorts of bee traps into the rainforest canopy by using a crossbow to shoot lines up into the canopy. We spent days and days doing this. And after a couple of weeks, we had caught a grand total of 0 bees. It was a complete bust scientifically. I never did figure out what species was pollinating those rainforest trees, but the experience sparked this fascination within me that has never died. And I have been looking for ways to chase after bees ever since in my work, but also just in daily life. And whenever I get out and am giving a talk about bees or leading a field walk or what have you, I find that many people are very surprised to learn that bees are so diverse, that there are 20,000 varieties of bees, different species roaming this planet, inhabiting every continent outside of Antarctica. And that's because when we think of bees, I think our minds, all of us, tend to turn to the one species we know best. And I'm going to share my screen with you now so we can get a look at one of those bees. And you should all see our dear honeybees right now. The deer, they're wonderful, wonderful bees. They're so social, they're so prolific, they mass in the tens of thousands in these communal hives commanded by a single queen. Totally fascinating biology. But I have to tell you that honeybees are the exception. The vast majority, there they are, a comb, isn't that marvelous? But the vast majority of bees are solitary creatures like this little mason bees. They're masons, they're diggers, they're miners, they're wool carders, they're carpenters, they're leaf cutters. They are living solitary lives out there digging holes in the ground, or they're chewing holes into twigs to build nests, or they're even occupying old snail shells. They use hose bibs, they'll use brick walls, they'll use cracks in the pavement, wherever they can find. They're solitary creatures. And many of these bees are tiny and they're hard to find. So it's not unusual for our insights about bees in general to come less through direct observation than by understanding the dramatic ways that bees have come to influence the world around us. And I would like to illustrate that point with a story out of the book that I wrote, Buzz, from chapter 4, that begins with a quotation that I love from the British poet Norman Rowland Gale. You voluble, velvety, vehement fellows that play on your flying and musical cellos, come out of my foxglove, come out of my roses, you bees with the plushy and plausible noses. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called flowers so blue and golden When he did that, he wasn't probably thinking about the visual receptors in the eyes of bees, but the prevalence of those shades in his much pondered blossoms was not a coincidence. They fall right in the middle of a bee's visual spectrum, and flowers adopt them specifically in a bid to woo bees as pollinators. The evolution of petal color often tracks very closely with a plant's strategy for getting its flowers fertilized. All the hues from mustard to cornflower to purple would be exceedingly scarce and might not exist in flowers at all if there had been no need to advertise for the services of bees. Scent is also a common bee-related trait, and Walt Whitman made a fine, if unintended, biological observation when he pined for a beautiful flower garden, quote, odorous at sunrise. Many floral fragrances do indeed surge during the morning hours, just as temperatures rise and hungry bees become active, seeking out flowers that have filled with nectar overnight. For plants, it is a perfect pollination opportunity and a ripe moment to advertise. If there were no bees in the equation, Whitman might have timed his walk for a moonlit night to get a good whiff of the cloying perfume given off by moth-pollinated flowers. Or he might never have considered an amble through a garden in the first place, since the majority of blossoms would reek of the musky terpenes and rotten flesh smells attractive to wasps and flies. The fact that bees prefer odors we find worthy of poetry counts as one of nature's happier accidents. Beyond color and smell, the very shapes of many flowers can also be traced to bees. While round blossoms generally appeal to all sorts of pollen and nectar seekers, bees included, most of the elaborate flowers evolved with specific visitors in mind. From an insect's perspective, round blooms, like this one, can be approached from any angle or direction with the same result. It's sort of a come one, come all display that often draws a crowd. If Claude Monet had included pollinators in his famous sunflower still lifes, he would have found himself busy adding in all manner of bees, not to mention hoverflies, bee flies, butterflies, wasps, and beetles. Flowers that diverge from round, however, can be more choosy in whom they invite and where they deposit their nectar. Where they deposit their pollen, excuse me. The wide banners of a pea flower or the lipped tube of a snapdragon display what is called bilateral symmetry. It's a concept that is also familiar from the shape of the human face. If you draw a line down the center from the top to the bottom, one half is a mirror image of the other. For flowers, this design creates clearly defined sides, as well as a distinct sense of up and down, requiring their visitors to enter in a specific way. Once that feat is accomplished, I'm going to pause for one moment while a tractor passes me at my Zoom spot here. It's a John Deere. My son would love it. A John Deere 3350. Looks like he's going to grade the road. Let's jump back in and say that once that feat of bilateral symmetry is accomplished in flowers, then flower parts can develop all sorts of adaptations for dabbing pollen in particular places on insects of a particular shape and size. But plants can only afford such a focused approach if their pollen is likely to stick to their intended targets, which makes bees with their pollen-attracting fuzz by far the most common callers at such blooms. Compared to his sunflowers, Monet would have found painting pollinators on his yellow irises a cinch, since bumblebees are virtually the only insects capable of getting the job done. With their deep tubes, upright orientation, and so forth, irises force the bees to land on a designated platform like this, and pass beneath a broad, pollen-laden stamen, placed, as one expert charmingly described it, quote, to fit exactly the dorsal surface of the humble bee. The female parts are there too, ensuring that the bee will deposit its pollen load in just the right location on the next iris that it comes to. So much of what we take for granted when we look at a flower boils down to the proclivities of bees. And flowers, in turn, have altered the bodies and the abilities of their buzzing visitors, from the fuzziness we talked about to their tongue length to distinctive bee habits of memory and navigation. And should any of us doubt for an instant just how tight these relationships can be, look no further than the blossoms of the genus Ophrys, the bee orchids, whose petals have taken on the very shape and texture of the insects they hope to attract, and who go so far as to produce the particular pheromones of a female bee, tricking amorous males into mounting these alluring blossoms again and again, like this fellow here. It's a pollination strategy defined by a technical botanical term that, unlike most technical botanical terms, requires no further explanation. It's called pseudocopulation. Totally outrageous. The bee doesn't even know he's visiting a flower. He thinks he's at the local bee pickup bar and he's met a fine lady. And it reminds us that moving pollen around isn't always this sort of benign reward thing. There's quite a lot of exploitation and trickery involved in those systems as well. But the complexity of pollination systems has really led to great diversity on both sides of the equation. We are familiar with the diversity of flowers in our garden, but we have a similar diversity of bees out there getting the pollination done. Now, a moment ago, I gave you a question that is common to 4-year-olds, why? But I think it's also worth considering a question very common to 14-year-olds, and that is, who cares? I know that's an important question to 14-year-olds because I live with one. Who cares? But I do think it's actually also a very important question. Why should we care about bees? Who cares, huh? But it's because people do care. I hear all the time from people who are concerned about bee declines, which, if you think about it, is pretty unusual for an insect. Do you hear ever about flies in the news, or cockroaches, or earwigs? If so, then certainly not with fondness. I mean, let's face it, by and large, nobody trusts an exoskeleton. When science fiction authors or horror film directors need a terrifying go-to monster, there's a reason they don't choose puppies or panda bears. Time and again, they find inspiration in the arthropods, the creepy crawlies, those invertebrates with soft, goopy bodies encased in a hard, chitinous exoskeleton. The mere sight of insects and spiders can trigger a measurable fear reaction in the human brain. Often, synapses associated with disgust also light up. Psychologists believe these feelings are innate and evolutionary, that there's a deep sense of otherness about those brittle, segmented bodies. It's as if, even from a safe distance, we know that these creatures would give a sickening crunch if we stepped on them. Yet, throughout human history, in all sorts of contexts, we have made a special exception for bees. To be clear, bees have exoskeletons, so they have waving antennae like all the other insects. And many of them have venomous stingers to boot, and their babies look like maggots. They don't exactly hide their otherness, but in cultures around the world, people have put their natural fears aside to bond with bees, watching them, tracking them, taming them, studying them, writing poems and stories about them, in some cases, even worshiping them. No other group of insects has grown so close to us. None is more essential, and none is more revered. Now, you might say, well, of course we like bees. Think of all the crops that they pollinate, the fruits, the vegetables, the nuts, the seeds that, depending on how you parse the math, make up as much as a third of the human diet. Fair enough, but that can't be the whole story, since people didn't even understand insect pollination until the 19th century, and yet our fondness for bees dates back millennia. To the ancients, they were the world's finest sources of sweetness in terms of honey, but also in terms of light. The best light in the world was from beeswax candles that burned with a much finer smell than a tallow candle or a fish oil lamp. You do the comparison at home in the comfort of your own home sometime. Beeswax versus fish oil. You'll see what I mean. But they were also the world's finest sources of writing tablets, the ancestor to the iPad and so forth. They were medicines. They gave people waterproofing technologies. They were even one of our earliest forms of intoxication in the form of mead. So people kept bees long before they tamed horses, camels, or even ducks, not to mention familiar crops like apples, oats, peas, watermelons, the onions you were talking about earlier. All of these things, even coffee came to us as a domesticated crop later than the domestication of bees. We know that beekeeping as a sport and hobby and art form dates back at least to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, where these sorts of sophisticated clay hives were ferried up and down the River Nile in time with seasonal wildflower blooms. And we also know they were domesticated independently in the pre-classical Mayan period, a different sort of bee domesticated in that situation. They had the good sense to domesticate a rainforest bee called the royal lady, which has the agreeable habit of lacking a sting. So bees show up again and again throughout recorded history, while traces of wax and honey show up everywhere from Neolithic pottery fragments to the world's oldest dental filling. But by one school of thought, our connection with bees shouldn't be measured in the thousands of years. It should be measured in the millions of years. A relationship with potential evolutionary consequences for our own species, as well as for that of a particular and peculiar African bird. Now, I want to share with you another story out of the book that comes to us from chapter 6. Also beginning with a quotation that I really enjoy. This one from the Dutch Renaissance scholar Erasmus, who said, "No bees, no honey." Now we're going to catch up with this narrative down in South Africa, where I was skipping out, frankly, on a conference I was supposed to be attending because I couldn't pass up the opportunity to look for native honeybees in their native habitat, a shrubby scrubland there called the fynbos. If I were writing a novel, this is the moment where I would tell you that a brownish robin-sized bird landed on a nearby twig, chattering excitedly to get my attention. Then I would describe how I followed that bird as it hopped and fluttered from branch to branch through the fynbos, leading me directly to the bees buzzing home. That didn't happen, but the strange thing is that it could have. The Greater Honey Guide earned its name through exactly the behavior I just described, ushering people to beehives with boisterous hopping, flapping, and an incessant cry that bird books describe as kee-kee-kee-kee-kee-kee-kee-kee-kee. The bird ranges widely across sub-Saharan Africa, and wherever it is found, traditional honey hunters have learned to rely on its unique talents. In one study, following honey guides increased the rate of bee nest discovery by 560%, and the birds consistently led hunters to colonies that were larger and more productive than the ones they discovered on their own. After a nest has been located and breached, the honey guide benefits by feasting on leftovers and scraps. Its specialized diet has resulted in an unusual ability to digest beeswax. As one early European observer noted, people customarily reward their avian helpers with a calculated gift of honeycomb. Quote, "The bee hunters never fail to leave a small portion for their conductor, but commonly take care not to leave so much as would satisfy its hunger. The bird's appetite being only whetted by this parsimony, it is obliged to commit a second treason by discovering another bee's nest in hopes of a better salary." Although no honey guide materialized to help me in the fynbos that afternoon, its habits are a commonplace, well known to ornithologists, and immortalized in one of the greatest scientific names of all time, indicator indicator. For over 2 centuries, common and scientific wisdom maintained that guiding behavior evolved between the bird and another hive raider, the ratel or honey badger, and that people had simply come along and learned to exploit the situation. It wasn't until the 1980s that a group of South African biologists pointed out what should have been obvious all along. Honey badgers are nocturnal, almost entirely nocturnal. They are also nearsighted and generally don't climb trees to the nests that are usually discovered by the birds. While their waking hours do overlap briefly with honey guides at dusk, such limited opportunities hardly seem like a good coevolutionary starting point, particularly for such a complex interaction. Now, the myth persists in natural history articles and even a best-selling children's book, but finding the real story behind honey guide behavior required biologists to go knocking on doors in an entirely different department of science. So I was curious about this, and to track down the real story and the origin of honey guide behavior, I spoke with a nutritional anthropologist named Alyssa Crittenden at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who made an absolutely remarkable discovery about the Hadza people of Tanzania, a group that's still living a traditional hunting and gathering lifestyle in the very landscape where our species is thought to have evolved. Now, the Hadza are honey hunters, and they do follow honey guides. This has been known for decades. But Alyssa was the first person to ask a basic question. Just how much honey do the Hadza eat? And the answer was surprising. Honey wasn't just an occasional treat. Men, women, and children all ranked it as their #1 favorite food, and they looked for it every single day, raiding the nests not just of honeybees, but of at least 6 other honey-making varieties. And over the course of the year, honey made up fully 15% of the Hadza diet, a figure far higher during certain seasons and higher still for the men, who did most of the collecting and ate a good portion of the day's harvest before returning to camp. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, but the idea becomes truly powerful in an evolutionary context, because Alyssa and her colleagues then posed another question. Well, would our ancestors, surviving in roughly the same landscape, in the same, living the same way, hunting and gathering in the very same landscape, would they have behaved any differently? I mean, after all, we know that chimpanzees eat honey, so why not Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and even Australopithecus? If we have been chasing after bees since the start, certainly explains the coevolution of honey guides. Why would a bird bother trying to attract the attention of a nocturnal badger when there were big bipedal apes out there in plain sight, scouring the savanna for bee nests all day long? But for Alyssa and her colleagues, the bird is a side note. The real discovery has to do with us, because the story of human evolution has always been a story about brain size. And the brain is what physiologists call metabolically expensive tissue. It takes a lot of energy to run the human brain. Up to 20% of our daily calories go to feed something that, for most of us, makes up only about 2% of our body weight. So if you want to evolve a bigger brain, then you need more fuel. And as Alyssa told me, quote, honey is the most energy-rich food in nature. Another paragraph then from the book that explains this. Like hunting animals, finding honey provided our ancestors with a rich nutritional reward for completing a complex task. It would have created a similar impetus for the development of cooperation and sharing, as well as tool use and the mastery of fire. Hand axes, flakes, and other stone implements led to efficiencies in killing and butchering game, but so too would they have allowed access to the larger bee nests hidden in trees. And while fire may have given us a nutritional boost through cooking, it would also have allowed the pacification of honeybees with smoke. If our ancestors did indeed search for honey as regularly as the Hadza do today, then each of these advances would have been accompanied by a huge surge in sugary calories. And as Alyssa reminded me several times during our conversation, bee nests also contain larvae and pollen, which provide even more calories, as well as protein and important micronutrients. Taken together, these dietary contributions make a strong case that learning to follow bees and honey guides influenced human evolution, helping our ancestors bolster their growing brains and, in the language of anthropology, quote, nutritionally outcompete other species. Now, there is food for thought for the day. Could it be that our primordial sweet tooth led us to bees and to honey, helping ultimately to make us human? That is a tantalizing notion. Now, if I were giving this presentation 100 years ago, I would stop now and take your questions. Even 50 or 25 years ago, I might not need to say another word. But here in the 21st century, it is impossible to talk about bees without also confronting the challenges that they face. Colony collapse disorder appeared on the scene in 2006, decimating hives across North America and Europe, and setting off a mad research scramble to understand why, to understand what was going on. I spoke with a bee scientist named Diane Cox Foster, who has been studying colony collapse disorder since the beginning. She helped coin the phrase, and she told me something surprising. Over the past several years, colony collapse disorder has almost disappeared. It now accounts for less than 5% of lost hives. Yet, professional beekeepers that know how to take care of honeybees continue to lose 30 to 40% of their hives every year. And studies of native wild bees have also shown steep declines for many species, including what were once the most common bumblebees on Lopez or San Juan Island. The western bumblebee, this you see here with the white rump, now almost extinct across most of its native range. So what began as an investigation of a particular malady affecting a particular species of bee has now grown into a grave concern about what may be affecting all bees. And after more than a decade of research, only one thing really seems, and that is that it's not one thing. There is no single factor that is responsible for bee declines. They are suffering what some specialists have begun calling multiple stress disorder. Diane summarizes those stressors as the 4 Ps: parasites, the deadly varroates that attach themselves to bees and feed upon their body fluids; pesticides, including the notorious and ubiquitous neonicotinoid pesticide class; pathogens, including a host of viruses, bacteria, even fungi that affect bees; and finally, poor nutrition, which requires a bit of explanation. It's simply the scarcity of flowers in our landscapes, where we are farming more industrially and reducing the flower resources across vast acreages. When you add climate change then and invasive species to the mix, things get even more complicated, particularly since all of these factors have the potential to interact. A pesticide, even that passes the bee safe tests in a lab, can become deadly in a field that has also been sprayed with a fungicide, for example. Or a virus that hardly impacts a healthy bee can kill one that's already stressed by parasites or a lack of nutrition. Bumblebee expert David Golson told me the issue really boils down to bee health. As he put it, quote, "Bees are starving, diseased, and poisoned. Small wonder they aren't thriving." But he went on to give me the good news. In spite of the complexity of the problems and the challenges of the research, we already know enough to take action, and to take action in very specific ways. By doing what we do in our gardens, providing more flowers, by providing more nesting habitat, by reducing pesticide use, by avoiding the long-distance movement of domestic bees and the pathogens that tend to travel with them. Putting these sorts of straightforward ideas into place and into practice can be transformational for bees, and efforts already underway on thousands of acres of farmland. I toured an almond orchard in California's Central Valley, one of the most intensely farmed places on Earth. And even there, with virtually all native habitat gone, a simple hedgerow of wildflowers had brought back all kinds of local species to that orchard. Like this here, which I photographed there in the Central Valley, a native sweat bee perched on a native gumweed. But perhaps the best news of all is that you don't have to be an expert like David Golson to help bees. Anyone can do it. We can all do it. You can help bees with a window box. You can help them in your backyard. You can help them in your garden. You can help them in your farm. It can be as simple as drilling holes in a block of wood to provide more nesting habitat, or as satisfying as choosing to plant flowers that don't require spraying. And if you do this, you will experience something that can be pretty unusual in the world of species conservation: instant gratification. I know this because a few years ago I had a blank spot, both spatially and temporally, if you will, in the little bee garden in front of my office. And I decided I would get some catmint in there. So I went and got some catmint at the store. You know, it blooms for a long time. Someone mentioned earlier that their catmint is still blooming. It's a really good nectar source for a lot of generalist bees. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get a little catmint in that blank spot. And before I could even get it out of the pot and into the ground, I had 4 species of native bumblebees nectaring on that catmint. So it is an embodification, you know, it embodies that catchphrase, if you build it, they will come. If you plant it, they will come to your garden. Now, in a moment, I will be happy to take your questions. I'm looking forward to it, but I do want to conclude with something new. I'm currently just wrapping up a book now on backyard biology, all sorts of things we can do to see and appreciate the nature close to home. And I want to share with you a very little story here, a small one that is a reminder, I think, to all of us that bees really are just the beginning when we're talking about pollinators. Someone earlier mentioned the wonderful wasps and predators that are attracted to the Apiaceae family flowers in the garden. A great example of that, and I want to give you another one. You know, we've got everything from flies to butterflies, moths, beetles, all sorts of pollinators out there, but this is a little wasp I want to tell you about. And this little story begins with another quotation. This time it's from the 19th century American writer, very popular writer at the time, Fanny Fern, who says, "There are no little things. Little things, so called, are the hinges of the universe." "What made that, Papa?" Noah asked, pointing down at a patch of sparse grass and clover by the side of the path. At first, I couldn't see what he was talking about, but when I squatted and looked at the bare soil between the plants, there it was, a tiny turret of dried mud. Thinner than a pencil and barely half an inch tall, it looked like a rustic ceramic vase, curved near the top and with a slightly flared lip. Up close, I could see that it was built from tiny balls of dirt, stacked and somehow smoothed together into an artful whole. But that didn't help me in the slightest. "I haven't got a clue, Noah," I said, and I meant it. It wasn't just that the species had stumped me. I couldn't tell him the family, the order, or even the phylum. A worm, an insect, a spider? Ignorance on that scale might be cause for embarrassment in some professions, but I felt only a growing sense of excitement. In biology, the unknown is every bit as important as the known. Without mysteries, there can be no discoveries. "Let's put a camera on it," I urged, and a quick dash to my office supplied the necessary equipment. Once we had the little video recorder whirring away, propped up by pebbles a few inches from the puzzling turret, we continued on with the project that had brought us outdoors in the first place, an after-school game of badminton. Later that evening, we downloaded our footage and scanned through it for signs of activity. Minutes passed at high speed, the grasses and clovers twitching in invisible breezes. We saw 2 thatch ants scurry by, indifferent to the turret, and then a tiny golden flower beetle appeared, pacing back and forth on a nearby leaf. I had begun to think our quarry must be something nocturnal when a dark shape suddenly streaked directly in front of the lens. It was gone in an instant. But seconds later it reappeared, and I paused the frame. There, fixed in mid-flight, was a perfect little black wasp. Thin-waisted and banded with creamy, pale stripes, it hovered directly above the turret. But would it enter, or was it just passing by? Frame by frame, we advanced the video as the wasp circled like a helicopter approaching a landing pad in rough weather. Then it alighted on the rim, tucked its wings neatly across its back, and disappeared down the tunnel. We gave a cheer of triumph, but I quickly realized that the video raised as many questions as it answered. After all, knowing that our quarry was a wasp didn't exactly narrow things down. According to the Catalog of Hymenoptera in America north of Mexico, a 16-pound reference set in my office, more than 12,500 different species could claim that title, from solitary hunters to parasitoids, gall makers, hornets, yellowjackets, mud daubers, and more. So the next afternoon found me right back where I started, crouched down beside the turret, doing what counts as work and reward for any backyard biologist, waiting and watching. Thank you all very much. With that, I want to turn it over to any questions that you may have that I could help you with this morning about the bees in your yard or bees in general, or any topic that strikes your fancy.
First of all, can we just say that was just thoroughly enchanting. Just enjoyed every minute. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Lynn.
So I'm opening up the chat. Hopefully people are going to bring in some other questions. So far, there's just my two. So I want everyone to write your question down. So I'm going to close that. My first question is, fact or fiction? Eating local honey enhances your immune system.
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know. I've certainly heard from many people that they have experienced a benefit from it, but I have yet to read ever a thorough and peer-reviewed scientific study
Yes.
that shows that association. But lots of anecdotal information for that sort of use, and then many other uses for honey in terms of medicines. There's a fellow I know here on San Juan who for years had been suffering from some sort of an eye problem, and he tried every seen every eye doctor, the antibiotics, kind of the itchy weepy eye thing, and then finally someone suggested that he try some honey. And so he started putting honey in his eyes, and it cleared up in an instant. And we know that there are antibacterial properties to honey, and it could be that it's just the thing to do the trick. But if you imagine, that resource for the bees, they're storing up, the honeybees are storing that stuff up for a rainy day when they can't go out and forage, or for those in the genus Apis, they want to get through the winter, so they have these stores of food, and it's got to last a long time. So it makes sense that you could have an antibacterial property in there that would prevent it from spoilage, and that may be the thing that cleared up this fellow's eyes as well. So if you look back through the history of medicine, you will see honey used in all sorts of wound care, and apparently a cure-all for eyes as well.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And second question, as I hope some more roll in, was, could you please close the loop on that badger and his role as the honey guide?
Yeah, so the badger, I mean, it's a marvelous, situation where for decades people just assumed that that is how things evolved in nature. If you see a bird that leads creatures to honey, and you see a creature in the same environment that eats the honey, that eats honey as well, that raids bee nests, that they must be related. And what it shows us is it's an illustration of our long habit of separating our own species from nature, right? We have this tendency to put a wall between the human world and the natural world, assuming that it's something that we only cross when we intend to. But yet, if we put ourselves back into the evolutionary history of our species in that environment, it makes far more sense that the bird would have co-evolved with these primates, our ancestors, who were out there looking for honey all the time, rather than trying to, at the end of the day at dusk, attract the attention of some nearsighted badger. That doesn't make any sense at all. So it's a really interesting example of how, when we start to think of ourselves in the context of the ecology of the place where we evolved, it really explains a lot of things, not only about our own behavior, but about some of the creatures in that environment too.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, this question is from Cynthia, And she is asking, do we have any data on bee and insect declines in San Juan County?
Oh, it's a good question. The fact is we don't have much data. One of the things about about this great diversity of bees is that there are so many species out there. There's very little data on a lot of those species. So the best we can do in terms of local species is look at some of the data that we do have on historical records for bumblebees, which are the biggest and showiest of the bees. We've got a dozen or so species here in the islands. Just added one to that list this earlier this spring, a big queen Nevada bumblebee, which I've never seen out here before. Very, very beautiful, remarkable bee. So if you look then at the history of collection records for some of these bees, you'll see that things like the Western bumblebee were very common here. If you had bee researchers come out in the 50s and swing a net around, they were going to get a whole bunch of these Western bumblebees. It was really a dominant bee, and they're virtually gone. I mean, you hardly ever see them now. It's believed that a disease really wiped them out from much of their former range. So we do have some indication of loss of bee diversity in terms of the few species that we have data for. Some of the better data on this comes from places in the Midwest where there were some studies done historically in prairie environments, and going back to those prairie environments then and seeing a drop in diversity in a similar landscape over time. But we just don't have a lot of baseline data out here in the islands.
All right, thank you. Okay, Krista has a question. The yellow jacket-like bee that builds the small golf ball sized nests, what is its name and is it a pollinator?
Oh, a splendid question. So now we're getting into some really good waspy. This is a wonderful segue from my last story to get us thinking more about wasps as pollinators and beneficial in gardens and so on and so forth. So if you want to talk about yellow jackets, you're talking about social wasps. And we have several species out here in the islands of social wasps. You will see those completely enclosed nests that are enclosed in paper. Those are the round ones that hang from a tree or the eaves of your house are yellow jackets in the genus Dolichovespula. And we have a couple of species that include the aerial yellow jackets that you see making those they're the yellow and black ones. You also see bald-faced hornets, which make those round nests like that, and they're black and white and even larger, same genus. So you have that whole group. You also have a big group in the genus Vespula, and Vespula tend to nest in the ground or inside of a crevice, like in a wall or something like that. They also build a paper nest. You just don't see it because it's in the ground or it's hidden in the wall. That's a very common yellow jacket around here. And then we have another genus that's very common for social wasps. And again, you look up in the eaves of your house, or you look underneath the picnic table or what have you, and you see it. They look like they never finished the job. You see these little nests, they've got a comb, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen, or if they get really big, a few dozen little hexagons in that comb, but they never get the rest of it around there. And they're always fumbling around on there. But that's just their nature. That is a completed nest. Those are paper wasps in the genus Polistes. And the common species that we see around here is actually European. There is a native one, you just rarely see it, but it looks very similar. So we have all of those different characters then in the social wasp group. And we are used to social wasps primarily in sort of a negative sense, in that they tend to visit our picnics, and you'll see them stealing bits of fried chicken or bologna or what have you, or if you're having a salmon barbecue, they're into the fish in an instant. And they're doing that because they are gathering up protein to take back to the nest, whatever, either the ball or under the ground or the little open cups there, to feed to their larvae, because they are carnivorous, they're predators. So when you see them pestering you at a picnic, they are shopping for the kids. But if you see them on your dill flowers or on your yarrow plants, or you'll see wasps oftentimes visiting, a whole variety in that group. Well, there's two groups there, Yower and the aster family. But anyway, you'll see them on flowers and even some other common flowers. You'll occasionally see a wasp on there. When they're doing that, they're feeding themselves. They're feeding themselves because the adult wasps like to drink flower nectar. They need the sugar rush to keep flying. But when they're gathering the protein, they're taking that back to feed to the kids. So another thing that you will see commonly for those wasps when they're not nectaring your flowers, someone was mentioning their aphids, aphid problem earlier. So the aphid honeydew, then the poop from the aphids, if you will, is still sweet when it comes out of the end, the rear end, the stern end of an aphid. That stuff is still pretty sweet, and it'll splatter down on the vegetation below, or on your car if you're parked underneath a willow tree infested with aphids, as I am often. And so you'll see a large number of yellow jacket social wasps feeding on that honeydew where it splashes down. Again, they're feeding themselves. They want the sugar so they can keep flying. So if you go out into our forests, our Doug fir forests here, even early in the morning, oftentimes you'll hear this humming up in the canopy. And what in the hell is going on up there? It's usually a whole bunch of yellow jackets that are feeding on honeydew from giant conifer aphids and that sort of thing. They're fueling up, tanking up to get started during the rest of their foraging for the day. So they do some incidental pollination when they're visiting flowers. They're not great pollinators because their bodies are smooth, because they're really interested in protein and they're just nectaring to feed themselves. They're not in the habit of carrying pollen away from the flowers. I mean, this is the great innovation that led to bees, was a dietary switch to becoming vegetarian and realizing they could feed pollen to the offspring, and the offspring could get the protein they needed from that vegetarian source. So they gave up the hunting lifestyle and started gathering pollen, and that's when they started getting fuzzy, developing branched hairs and depressions and things on their legs for balling up pollen to carry efficiently back to the nest. All of that evolution stemmed from that dietary shift that the wasps didn't do. The wasps are predators. They've been predators throughout. So they will carry some pollen incidentally, but they're not really good at it.
So interesting. Okay, thank you. Okay, Mindy would like to know, could you talk for a moment about bee communication?
Yes, bee communication. So bee communication it's very different from how we are communicating right now, where we're doing a lot of things visually. I'm moving my hands, I'm talking to you, I'm making noise, you're soaking it in, and we're going back and forth. For bees, a lot of that kind of communication actually happens through chemicals. And it makes total sense when you think about, say, for honeybees, a good portion of the communication occurs in the hive. And if you're going to be in a hive, well, it's totally dark. It's dark in there, and you're just crowded around, surrounded by all of these other bees. And if you want to communicate, the best way to do it in that dark setting is to do it through chemicals. So you have all of these pheromones and cues that bees use to communicate with one another, combined with some visual cues as well. The honeybees famously do what they call a waggle dance, where they move in sort of a prescribed way that other bees can interpret to communicate the direction and distance to good flower resources. That is a famous honeybee characteristic. So there's some visual cues, a lot of chemical cues, and a little bit of sound too, perhaps, in some of the buzzing that they make that goes along with some of those displays. But it's primarily a chemical situation, and they sniff it up primarily through the sense organs on those feelers, if you will. Antennae is the official term, but I think kids are actually a lot more accurate when they call antennae feelers, because really that is the main way that a bee or another insect is feeling the world around it, through a lot of touch and chemical cues coming in through those sensory organs.
Nice. Okay, let me check and see if there's anything else. I don't know if we want to open the floor for someone that didn't have access to chat. If someone wants to unmute themselves and ask another question. Well,
question.
go ahead.
So, Tor, we don't keep honeybees, and none of our neighbors seem to keep honeybees. Yet we seem to have an awful lot of honeybees. Do we have any feel for the wild population here as opposed to the domestic population?
Good question. So honeybees, first of all, can travel long distances to a good pollen and nectar source. So if your flower garden is going off, particularly, we see that sort of later in the season when the native wildflowers are, most of them are, have gone by. And yet you're watering your garden, you've planted because you want flowers throughout the season. And so fortunately that works for bees too. They want flowers all the time. So they will find those sources, particularly later in the season, and they'll fly long distances to it. So you could very well have someone with a domesticated hive, a mile away that's, where bees are constantly coming over to forage in your garden. But we also do then have bees that have gone feral. The honeybees, these are not local species. It's a European and African species that we have domesticated and brought here. But they do go feral, and they have kind of a rough time. The Pacific Northwest, we got some bees, but it's not great bee country because it's so wet and cool in the wintertime that it's hard for honeybees, for example, to make it through the winter, survive the long, wet, cool winter. It's not necessary. It's the cold gets them, but it's also the fungus, and bacteria and so forth, because it's damp. The best, highest bee diversity in the world is not in a place like a tropical rainforest. Yeah, they got their bees, but where you really see high bee diversity is in Mediterranean climates, desert climates as well, where you have sort of dry, warm conditions. Now, the American Southwest, they've got way more bees in Arizona than we have here in the Pacific Northwest, because it's, even though, you don't see a lot of flowers when you go out, most times a year, they have these big blooms all at once, plenty of food. So the bees come out and they do their foraging and they mate and they, have their next generation. And then throughout those dry months, when not much is going on, the bees are underground. And because it's so dry, or they're in their twig nests or wherever the hell they are, because it's so dry, they don't get infected by the same rates of fungal diseases and bacteria and so forth that impact bees here. So those are the places where you really see the highest biodiversity of bees. Getting through the winter here for honeybees is a bit tough. So we do have some feral bees, and you'll see them, hives here and there, and you will see occasional swarms. When you see a swarm of bees, those are the honeybees, the non-natives, but it's a marvelous, thrilling thing to experience. You will see some swarms as well. So they will get out, and I know of a couple places over the years where we've seen them not too far from our house. But when you see them in your garden, it could very well be there from a domestic hive someplace in the distance.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
Any other questions? You can just pop in like Gail. Well, Tor, I think that wraps it.
Yeah, we've talked long enough. So the sky,
Yeah.
the clouds have parted. Sunshine now. I started in fog and I'm in sunshine. Thank you very much, you guys. This has been a lot of fun, and I applaud your efforts, and I hope that you have good success with your gardens, including for pollinators. Someone mentioned that they planted the Douglas aster. Great bee species, great bee species. Put those Douglas asters out there, and you're going to get a whole bunch of bees, because it blooms late in the season, which is rare for our native wildflowers. So that's a really nice one to have. Also, it gets a lot of skipper butterflies, so you'll see the butterflies on there too. Anyway, wonderful being with you all, and I thank you for the invitation.
Such an honor to spend a morning. Thank you.
Thank you.